Chapter 5. The Scientific Puppet and the Racist Hunchback. Fishberg's book was never translated into Hebrew, nor did 3 other books that continued his scientific legacy attract any attention in Israel. Harry L. Shapiro's Anti-Racist: The Jewish People, A Biological History, published in 1960. The Myth of the Jewish Race, a massive tome by Raphael Patai and his daughter Jennifer Patai. And The Myth of the Jewish Race, A Biologist's Point of View, by Alan Korkos. None of them was translated into Hebrew, and their theses were never discussed in Israeli arenas of culture and research. It would seem that the scientific structure that Ruppin and Salomon installed in Jerusalem in the 1930s and 1940s effectively blocked the importation into Israel of anthropological and genetic literature that cast doubt on the very existence of a Jewish race nation, and might have impeded the ideological production line of the Zionist enterprise. After the Second World War, of course, the use of the terms race and blood became awkward. In 1950, a much-publicized declaration by a number of senior scientists, under the aegis of UNESCO, completely rejected any connection between biology and national cultures, stating that the concept of race was a social myth rather than a scientific fact, after which serious researchers avoided the term. But this general acceptance did not deter the workers in the life sciences in Israel, nor did it undermine the profound Zionist belief in the common origin of the wandering people. The Jewish race disappeared from the vocabulary of conventional research, but it was replaced by a scientific field with a respectable title, the study of the origin of the Jewish communities. Popular journalism dubbed it simply the search for the Jewish gene. The State of Israel, which had begun to import people from the Jewish communities of Europe and later imported many Jews from the Muslim world, was now confronted with the urgency of creating a new nation. As noted in previous chapters, the principal function in this cultural production was undertaken by the Hebrew intellectuals who had immigrated to Mandatory Palestine and whose early educational endeavor preceded the establishment of the state. The organic history of the Jewish people, stretching from the Bible to the Palma, a combat force of the Prestate Jewish community, was taught throughout the state educational system. Zionist pedagogy produced generations of students who believed wholeheartedly in the ethnic uniqueness of their nation. But in the age of scientific positivism, nationalist ideology needed more substantial reification than the soft materials produced in the humanities. The biological laboratories were called upon to provide it, and at first they did so in fairly subdued manner. Nurit Kirsch, who in recent years completed her doctoral dissertation at Tel Aviv University, has investigated the early stages of genetics research in Israel. 34 Her conclusion is unambiguous: genetics, just like archaeology at the time, was a tendentious science subordinated to the national historical concept, which sought at all costs to discover a biological homogeneity among the Jews in the world. The geneticists internalized the Zionist myth and, consciously or not, attempted to adapt their findings to it. As she sees it, the main difference between the Zionist anthropologists in the Prestate period and the new scientists in Israel was that genetics became less prominent in the public arena in Israel. Research findings that, despite their ideological bias, were published in international scientific journals were hardly noticed in the Hebrew language media. This meant that their pedagogical function in the general education system was marginal. It is possible that in the 1950s and early 1960s the new and hesitant Israeli genetics served only the professional elite. But the attempt to detect a Jewish particularity in fingerprints, for example, or the search for diseases that only Jews were subject to, did not succeed. It transpired that Jews did not have fingerprints specific to ancient deicides, and that diseases found among Eastern European Jews, for example, Tay-Sachs, did not resemble diseases found among Iraqi or Yemenite Jews, for example, Favism. But the valuable biomedical and genetic information accumulated in Israeli laboratories would later achieve a more respectable status. In 1978, Oxford University Press published The Genetics of the Jews, by a team of researchers headed by Arthur E. Moron. This British scholar was influenced by a much-loved mentor who belonged to a sect that believed the British people were descendants of the 10 lost tribes, hence his interest in the Jews. For much of his life, the enthusiastic Moron believed that he and all the people around him were authentic Jews. When the British forces captured Palestine, he was convinced that this signaled the beginning of salvation. Years later, he set out to discover the common biological origin of the real Jews, and adapted his genetic anthropology to the biblical story. As the Israeli geneticist Raphael Falk described it, the British scientist first fired his arrows, then drew the target around them. To Moron and his colleagues, the marked differences between Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews notwithstanding, they all had to have a single common origin. By examining the frequency of A and B alleles in separate communities, he strove to show that the genes of Jews from different regions displayed a higher degree of uniformity than could be found when those same subjects' genes were compared to those of their non-Jewish neighbors. But if the genetic findings did not exactly support the ideological purpose, it would be necessary to search for other results. Although Moron's theory was weak and unfounded, the application of genetics to such diffuse categories as Ashkenazi and Sephardic was senseless, as they represent varieties of religious rituals. It legitimized and invigorated the search for the Jewish gene in the life sciences at Israeli universities. The passage of time since the Second World War removed the remaining inhibitions. Israel's rule since 1967 over a growing non-Jewish population intensified the urge to find an enclosing ethnobiological boundary. In 1980, an article by Bathsheba Bonnet-Amir of Tel Aviv University's School of Medicine, entitled A New Look at the Genetics of the Jews, appeared in the Israeli Science Monthly Madda, Science. The writer proudly described the originality of the fresh search for the Jewish genes, and opened the article with the statement in the 1970s many new studies were published in the field of the genetic anthropology of the Jews, studies dealing with such subjects as what is the origin of the Jewish people? And is there a Jewish race? Before the 1970s, she asserted, the studies were biased because of the anti-racist motivations that lay behind them. They set out to emphasize the genetic differences between Jewish communities. The new studies, however, based on tremendous developments in the field, highlighted the basic genetic similarities among the various communities, and the small proportion of alien genes in the genetic stock characteristic of Jews. One of the prominent findings shows the genetic kinship between the Jews of North Africa, Iraq and the Ashkenazis. In most cases they form a single block, whereas the non-Jews, Arabs, Armenians, Samaritans and Europeans, were significantly remote from them. The scientist hastened to point out that she had not set out to isolate a Jewish race. On the contrary, she had intended to use blood groups to reveal the heterogeneity of Jewish characteristics, but was quite astonished by the new findings. These corroborated the literature about the dispersal and wanderings of the Jews from ancient times to the present. At last, biology confirmed history. The Zionist idea of the Jewish nation race materialized as a solid life science, and a new discipline was born, Jewish genetics. What could be more convincing than publication in respected journals in the Anglo-Saxon world? The gates of Western canonical science, mainly in the United States, opened to the industrious Israeli researchers, who regularly blended historical mythologies and sociological assumptions with dubious and scanty genetic findings. Despite the limited resources available in Israel for academic research, it became a world leader in the investigation of the origins of populations. In 1981, Israel hosted the 6th International Conference on Human Heredity, with Professor Bontemir acting as its secretary. From that time on, Israeli researchers received generous funds from government and private foundations, and the scientific results soon followed. Over the next 20 years, interest in Jewish genetics spread to the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, the Weizmann Institute in Rehovot, and the Technion in Haifa. No less significant was that, in contrast to the cautious 1950s, the findings were now trumpeted in the public arena. Toward the end of the 20th century, the average Israeli knew that he or she belonged to a definite genetic group of fairly homogeneous ancient origin. In November 2000, the Israeli daily Haaretz published an illuminating report about the research of Professor Ariella Oppenheim and her colleagues at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. The actual findings were published that month in Human Genetics, a scientific periodical published by Springer Verlag in Germany. The reason for the media interest was the discovery made by the team of a remarkable closeness between certain mutations in the Y-chromosome of Jews, both Ashkenazi and Sephardic, and those of the Israeli Arabs and the Palestinians. The conclusion reached was that 2/3 of the Palestinians and roughly the same proportion of Jews shared 3 male ancestors 8,000 years ago. In actual fact, the expanded scientific paper showed a somewhat more complex, and much more confusing, picture. Those mutations in the Y chromosome also indicated that the Jews resembled the Lebanese Arabs more than the Czechs, but the Ashkenazis, as opposed to the Sephardics, were relatively closer to the Welsh than to the Arabs. The study had been written and edited during the period of the Oslo Accords, before the outbreak of the Second Intifada. Unfortunately, by the time it appeared in print, the uprising had already broken out. The genetic data showing that Jews and Palestinians had some ancient ancestors in common did not cause the conflict to be described as an internecine war, but it did indirectly reinforce the assumption, which had struck root some time earlier, that the origin of all the Jews lay unquestionably in the Near East. The rigor of those investigating Jewish DNA in Israel was demonstrated by the sequel to the team's biological adventure. A little over a year after the first important discovery, the inside pages of Haaretz carried a sensational news scoop. It transpired that the genetic resemblance between the Jews and the Palestinians, discovered by the previous research, did not exist. The scientists admitted that their earlier experiment had not been sufficiently grounded and detailed, and that its conclusions had been hasty. In fact, the Jews, or, at any rate, the male ones, were related not to the neighboring Palestinians but rather to the distant Kurds. The new paper, published first by the American Society of Human Genetics, showed that the sly Y chromosome had fooled its inexperienced investigators. But never fear, the updated genetic picture still indicated that the Ashkenazi and Sephardic Jews were related, only now they did not resemble the local Arabs, but rather the Armenians, Turks, and chiefly, as noted, the Kurds. Needless to say, it is not suggested that the raging Intifada had indirectly advanced the science of genetics in Israel, yet from then on the blood brothers were once more apart and alien. The scientific correspondent of Haaretz, who was positive that the Jews were the descendants of the ancient Hebrews, at once approached historians of antiquity to explain this disturbing discovery of a strange origin. Several respected professors were unable to help. They had no information about an ancient migration from the northern Fertile Crescent to the area of Canaan. The patriarch Abraham famously made a lyre from southern Iraq. Was it possible that the finding corroborated the thesis that the Jews descended from the Khazars, rather than from the seed of the venerable Abraham? Speaking by telephone from Stanford University in the United States, the respected scientist Professor Mark Feldman assured the correspondent that there was no need to reach such an extreme conclusion. The particular mutation in the Y chromosome of the Kurds, Armenians and Jews was also found in other peoples in the region of the Fertile Crescent, not necessarily in the Khazars, people forgotten by God and history. Barely a year later, Haaretz came up with a new report. It was now quite certain that the Jewish males originated in the Near East, but with respect to Jewish women the investigation had run into an awkward difficulty. A new scientific study that investigated the mitochondrial DNA, which is inherited only from the mother, in 9 Jewish communities discovered that the origin of the supposedly kosher Jewish women did not lie in the Near East at all. This worrisome finding showed that each community had a small number of founding mothers, but they were not interconnected at all. The uncomfortable explanation was that Jewish men had come from the Near East unattached and were forced to take local wives, whom they undoubtedly converted to Judaism in the proper manner. This last dubious revelation worried those rooting for the Jewish gene, and a doctoral dissertation apparently began to be written at the Haifa Technion, concluding that in spite of the ancient mother's scandalous disrespect for Jewish uniqueness, some 40% of all the Ashkenazis in the world descend from 4 matriarchs, as in the Bible. Haaretz, as always, reported the discovery faithfully and extensively. Mariv, a more popular daily, added that those ancient grandmothers were born about 1,500 years ago in Eretz Israel, from whence their families migrated to Italy, later to the Rhine and the Champagne regions. A summary of this reassuring dissertation by Doron Behar about Ashkenazi mitochondrial DNA was published in the American Journal of Human Genetics. Its supervisor was Karl Skarecki, a veteran researcher in Jewish genetics. This Orthodox professor, who came to the Technion's medical school from the University of Toronto, had earlier attracted attention when he discovered the amazing seal of priesthood. Skarecki himself is of course also a Cohen, and an incident at his synagogue in Canada, in the 1990s prompted him to investigate his aristocratic origin. Fortunately, he was invited by Rabbi Yaakov Kleiman, who as well as being a Cohen himself, was also the director of the Center of Kohanim in Jerusalem, to investigate the origin of all those named Cohen in our time. The Center of Kohanim is an institution that is preparing for the construction of the Third Temple in Jerusalem. For this purpose, it trains the future priests who would serve in the temple when the Al-Aqsa Mosque is demolished and the Jewish temple rises in its place. The center must have been well endowed financially to be able to fund the wished-for research. This story might seem esoteric and fantastic, but given the ethnic realities of the late 20th century, it grew into a solid science that attracted unusual attention and created a large following in Israel and the Jewish world. The Kohanim, the ancient blood aristocracy descended from Aaron, the brother of Moses, became unexpectedly popular in the age of molecular genetics. Sections of the genome called haplotypes, defined as a group of alleles of different genes on a single chromosome that are linked closely enough to be inherited, usually as a unit, were supposedly found to be distinctive among more than 50% of the men surnamed Cohen. Scientists from Britain, Italy and Israel participated in Skarecki's investigation, and its findings were published in the prestigious British journal Nature. It proved beyond question that the Jewish priesthood was indeed founded by a common ancestor 33 centuries ago. The Israeli press hastened to publish the discovery, to great genetic joy. The amusing aspect of this story is that the priestly gene could just as easily be a non-Jewish gene. Judaism is inherited from the mother, so it would not be far-fetched to assume that since the 19th century a good many non-believing Kohanim have married Gentile women, although the Halakha forbids them to do so. These men may well have fathered non-Jewish offspring, who, according to Skarecki's research, would bear the genetic seal of the Kohanim. But Jewish scientists are not expected to consider minor details, especially as God is no longer involved. In this era of enlightened rationalism, pure Jewish science has replaced the ancient Jewish faith, with its burden of prejudices. While the media celebrated the discovery and overlooked the potential contradiction in the thesis of the Jewish priestly gene, nobody asked why a costly biological investigation was devoted to the search for a hereditary religious caste. Similarly, no newspaper bothered to publish the findings of Professor Uzi Ritter, of the Department of Genetics at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem, who had examined those same priestly haplotypes on the Y-chromosome and found nothing distinctive about them. Once again, the public's veneration of the hard sciences paid off. Laymen have no reason to doubt the truth of information derived from what is perceived to be a precise science. Like the field of physical anthropology in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which released dubious scientific discoveries to the race-hungry public, the science of molecular genetics at the end of the 20th and beginning of the 21st century feeds fragmentary findings and half-truths to the identity-seeking media. Yet so far, No research had found unique and unifying characteristics of Jewish heredity based on a random sampling of genetic material whose ethnic origin is not known in advance. By and large, what little is known about the methods of selecting test subjects seems very questionable. Moreover, the hasty findings are all too often constructed and supported by historical rhetoric unconnected to the research laboratories. The bottom line is that, after all the costly scientific endeavors, a Jewish individual cannot be defined by any biological criteria whatsoever. This is not to preclude the potential contribution of genetic anthropology in uncovering important aspects of human history, and importantly in the fight against disease. Most probably, the investigation of DNA, a relatively young science, has a brilliant future. But in a state in which the law prevents marriage between a Jew and a non-Jew, we should be very wary about research that seeks genetic markers common to the chosen people. Like similar investigations carried out by Macedonian racists, Lebanese phalangists, Lapps in northern Scandinavia, and so on, such Jewish-Israeli research cannot be entirely free from crude and dangerous racism. In 1940 the philosopher Walter Benjamin told a story about a famous chess-playing automaton, known as the Turk, that used to astonish audiences with its clever moves. Underneath the table hid a hunchbacked dwarf who actually played the game. In Benjamin's analogy, the automaton represented materialistic thinking, and the hidden dwarf theology, meaning that in the age of modern rationalism, religious faith had to stay hidden. This image may be applied to the culture of biological science in Israel, and the public arena that it periodically furnishes with novelties. The genetic robot appears to be making the moves on the chessboard, while the little hunchback, the traditional idea of race, is obliged to hide because of the politically correct world discourse, yet continues to dupe and conduct the thrilling chromosome show. In a state that defines itself as Jewish yet does not present distinguishing cultural markers that might define a worldwide secular Jewish existence, except for some depleted, secularized remnants of religious folklore, the collective identity needs a misty, promising image of an ancient biological common origin. Behind every act in Israel's identity politics stretches, like a long black shadow, the idea of an eternal people and race.